So we're sitting here with Melissa Studdard. Did I say that right? Studdard?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome.
You'll edit out anything stupid, right?
Yes. Yeah. Okay, so how long have you been pursuing poetry?
Actually, it's been sort of a fit and start kind of thing. I started when I was in my early 20s, and I went to Sarah Lawrence and got my MFA and did all of that, and then my daughter was born and I got divorced when she was 2, so I started just really focusing on being a mom for a long time. I was working a lot because I was the head of household and all of that, so I didn't write for about 10 years, and then I just started again a few years ago. So.
Why did you become a poet?
I don't think I really had a choice. I think after hearing your poetry too, I think maybe you're going to know what I mean by this, but I think I would have maybe gone crazy if I hadn't become a poet, because I feel a real drive to write poetry. I feel a need to express myself that way, and I feel like I kind of am writing poems in my head, and it's just a matter of transferring it to paper. So either I would be like the crazy person who's talking to myself in my head, or I would be a poet. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like a compulsion.
Okay.
And I love poetry too. I mean, I love reading poets and other people's poetry. Whenever I have time to read, I almost never read a novel. I almost always read a collection of poetry. And my favorite collections I've read so many times, I'm starting to have them memorized. So.
Okay. So let's talk about your releases. You have a book out. Can you talk a little bit about the book?
Sure. It's called I Ate the Cosmos for Breakfast, and it came out in September of 2014 from St. Julian Press. And it's a collection of poems that I've written over several years, because it's my first collection, so it dates back to the stuff that I was writing in graduate school. There are a few of those, just stuff over the years. So it is like all first collections. It's a little eclectic, but it also has a theme that runs through it, which is there are a couple of themes that run through it. One is the concept of eating and sort of devouring life, and just being in love with life and consuming it and wanting to consume it. So there's that, and then there's also a spiritual theme that runs through it, and as we talked about earlier tonight about God being the woman in the book, and then there's also kind of a not romantic, but the desire to consume is not just a desire to have food. It's a desire in all the different meanings of the word. Desire to live, desire to love. So that's pretty much what it's about.
I've talked with several poets, and they have this idea of the muses. What are the muses for you?
That's an excellent question, and I think inspiration for me comes in a lot of different ways, and I like the idea of a muse because I like to personify things, and so like in my own mind I've kind of personified a muse, and then also personified an internal critic who, and they have very specific jobs, and it's actually helped me to just say, like, okay, critic, I need you to just step out of the room for a little while the muse and I do our business, and then you can come back when we're ready for you and when we're in the revision process. So that's been a really nice thing. But aside from that, just in life, I'm just inspired by other people's poetry. That's probably the top thing. I'm inspired by art. I'm inspired by things that I hear about, my relationships with other people, things that are going on in the world and in the news. It's like, I think when you're a poet, I think everything is in the news. It's like almost muse pantheism, like instead of God being in all the, in everything, in every tree, in every lamp, and every wheel of the car, it's also the muses there too. You just drive along, you see a wheel turning in the car, and you're like, oh, the wheel's turning in the car, being some image in a poem.
Well, let's go ahead and define poetry. What's poetry for you?
Poetry. I'm going to give you two different answers to that. One a little academic, and then the other one a little more personal. I'm going to start with the academic because it's an easier way for me to get into this and address it. But this is something that I sort of wrangle with my students over every semester, because they come in wanting to just write rhyming poetry, and they think that if something rhymes, that means it's a poem. And that's verse, that's not poetry, right? So we have to have that discussion like at length. So then I tell them, technically there are all these different elements that go into a poem, and sometimes they're all there, sometimes some of them are there, sometimes two of them are there, sometimes seven of them are there, but they combine in different ways, and that makes a poem. So you never really know exactly what it's going to be. It's going to be different each time. It's just that there is some combination of those elements. And I'm talking about things like figurative language and sound other than rhyme, like alliteration. And there are all these beautiful things that make poetry. And sometimes one thing is at the forefront, and sometimes it's another thing. So that's my technical answer. But thinking about it a little more deeply, just thinking personally about what a poem is to me, I think a poem is it's kind of like an opportunity to witness the way the mind works in a physical, tangible way. Because one of the things that I really love about poetry is each time, you hear, like tonight, we heard all these poets read. Each person's poetry is so different from each other person's poems, and you learn about how that person thinks. And so, we're all going around, going back to the theme of my book, and ingesting the world, and then just like in a dream, it comes back out, but it's put together all differently. And to me, if I had to relate poetry to something other than poetry, the thing that it most closely resembles is a dream. So.
Okay. So you mentioned that you're a teacher, so I have a question for you, because I've heard a lot of people say something along these lines. It's been discussed, is poetry dead? And one of the things that killed poetry is academics. So this is a two-part question. One, obviously, do you think poetry is dead? And two, do you think academics is sort of a hindrance to poetry, or is it sort of like an enlightenment? What are your thoughts on academics and poetry?
Okay, so first of all, I think that poetry is not dead. In fact, I know it's not dead. I just saw it over there. And it was well. It had, pink cheeks, and it was doing fine. So, academically speaking, I do not think that academics have killed poetry, though I do think that a lot of people in academia have certainly made a valiant effort to kill it. And I think that academia can be great for poetry, and teaching can be great for poetry, but the problem is that poetry is meant to be celebrated and enjoyed and appreciated and spoken aloud, read aloud to each other. I think when it's kind of like, not to be gross or anything, but if you vivisected something, you would kill it, you would dissect it, it would no longer be alive. And I think that people do that to poetry sometimes. And it's not just poetry. It's other things too that are taught in that manner. When something is taught in that manner, like we're going to pick it apart and we're going to say, there are 7 metaphors in this poem, and this poem symbolizes death, and the theme of this poem is this. And when you get really sort of rigorous and academic about it, it's no good. I've tried teaching my students that way at times, and I just see the light go out of their eyes. And poetry is not about washing the light out of you, it's about lighting you up. So that does the exact opposite of what it's meant to do. I think if it's taught properly, that doesn't happen. And I'm not, criticizing anyone specific, because I've certainly taught it in the wrong way myself at times when I was first beginning teaching. Now I don't do that. Now I try to make it about what it's about and try to help the students find things in the poems that relate to their own lives or things that they know and care about. And I just teach it in a completely different way. So I think it's important. It's really important to teach it in the right way. Is it dead? No. And I'll tell you what, one thing that I find really interesting about poets and poetry is that every generation there is a group of poets who it seems like they feel like they're rebels or something because they're writing poetry and no one else is writing poetry. But it's like with teenagers, there keeps being new generations of teenagers. There keeps being new generations of poetry. It doesn't die. People love it. It's not as prominent in our culture as I think it should be, and I think that's partially a symptom of the culture that we live in. If you look at what people are surrounded by all day, every day, it's mostly stories. So I think we're more geared towards fiction. I mean, people watch TV, they watch movies, commercials are, oftentimes narratives, billboards are narrative-oriented. So I think, if you ask a student, you bring in a bunch of students who've never written before and you ask them to write a story, they know what a story is without even being told. But they haven't been exposed to poetry very much, and if they have, it's usually not good poetry. So, but what I see is that when students start learning about it, they all want to write it, and a lot of them connect to it a lot more than they connect to the fiction. So.
It seems like the American culture is more of a culture of business in a way. When major publishing companies sell a book, it's more something that they can make into a movie just to generate sales. Do you think that the publishing market has a influence on how poetry is accepted in culture today?
I mean, to some extent it does, because the publishing industry will always have some kind of impact on publication, obviously, because that's what they do. But right now, it's a really different world out there, and it's exciting. I mean, there are the big houses, there are small presses, there are university presses, there are people who are self-publishing, there are local publishers who are publishing people in their communities. And I think that what's happening is that a lot of those books that are being published by smaller presses are going on to win awards and things, and they're starting to get a lot of attention. And I think that at one time, the big publishing houses, there was probably a few that you could name that were like gatekeepers. They would determine who could even be published and who couldn't. But that's gone now. I mean, certainly there's still a little bit of like a hierarchy. So I mean, that's still there a little bit, but I think that is starting to fade away, because even if you look at some of the books that have won some of the big prizes in the past few years, they're not all on just large presses anymore. You're starting to get small, independent presses, university presses, their books are winning these awards, and it's exciting. So no, I don't think it's as much as it used to be. I think that's one good thing that's happening right now.
The internet's made a lot of things easier, more accessible. I mean, we just came from a reading where people use their data to get their poetry from their cell phones. Do you think
young people with good eyes?
Yeah. Do you think that this easy access to the internet has made a hindrance to poetry, or has it just helped poetry even more?
I think it's done both. I mean, I think almost everything has a little good and a little bad that comes with it, and I think the good thing is that it is more widely available, more people are exposed to it, more people are becoming interested in it. You have someone who loves poetry, and they're posting poetry all the time on their social media, and then their friends who weren't interested in poetry before take a liking to it, and they start reading poetry. So that aspect of it is good. The thing that I think is not quite as good is that sometimes poetry is not sort of given the space and the air and the time that it needs to sort of go into the person, because it's being taken in these quick little bursts in the internet. And I wish that it was a little different. Ideally I picture someone sitting there reading a book and really thinking about it. So sometimes people just glance at something on the internet and move on, but they're exposed to it, so in that sense it's good. So
there's an article online that says you can tell a medium is still vital if it can change anything. Can poetry change anything?
That's a really interesting question. I know for sure that it can change people's lives, individual people's lives, because I meet people all the time who tell me stories of how this or that book changed their life. I have a friend who survived a lot of childhood abuse, and she wrote a book about it, and people actually write to her and tell her that her book saved their life because they were thinking about committing suicide, and they read her book and it made them understand that they weren't alone and that this happens, and they felt that human connection. And I think that's probably the most vital thing that poetry has to offer. I think that one thing that poets do that you don't see a lot of other people just walking around out in the community doing is that they just are really open, they're very raw, they very much just say, here world, here I am, these are my experiences, and if anything in this can help you, then just take it, and that's I love poets. It's a very generous and beautiful, amazing, fearless thing, and it impacts people. And I think politically that poems also have when people write poems and they get a large following, and this is another thing that the internet is good for, is that there have been some poems now that have gained this kind of huge pop culture kind of following, and that can affect change over time, and it affects, I think one of the most important things is that it affects the way people think, and you have poets who are activists, and they're writing about these important matters, and people become interested in those things, and they go out and they become activists too, and it does change things.
Well, my last question tonight is, as a poet, what's your message to younger writers, to people who are just getting their faces out there and then wanting to expose their poetry to the world?
Well, I think the most important thing that I would want to say to a younger writer, and I have a few things to say, but the most important one is that you should realize that you are the only person who has your exact genetic composition combined with the exact experiences that you've had and the diet that you've had of what you've read, what you've seen, what you've watched. There's only one you, and so if you want to write, you do have something absolutely unique to put out there. Each person does, and language is a medium that most of us have. So, I would just say recognize that you have the right to tell your story, that your voice is important, and that people want to hear you. And I would also recommend that anybody who is younger who really wants to be a poet realize that it's a combination of work and play. There is the revising and the editing and all of that, but it's also a wonderful, playful, if you love it, it's also just a delight. It's like playing at the same time. And I would also recommend to realize that you are really serious about it, you need to give it that serious place in your life, and not like just treat it as a hobby. So for instance, it would be important to set aside certain times to write every week or every day or however often you want to do it, and maybe even write it in your calendar, like just as if you had an appointment for something, and then if somebody calls and tries to ask you to do something, you look at your calendar like, oh no, that's my writing time. And treat it like that. Treat it like something that's really important, that's important enough to go on your calendar right by the doctor's appointment, and really do it. Because I think one of the things that happens is people have this passionate urge to write, but then the life just gets in the way. All these other little things get in the way, little and big things. You have to change your oil in your car, you have to cook dinner, you have to eat dinner, you have to bathe, God forbid. So, you have to think of poetry as being as important as eating and changing the oil in your car and doing all the other things you do.
Well, Melissa, I want to thank you for your time. Really, it's been a pleasure sitting down with you and listening to your thoughts. And you did a wonderful reading.
Oh,
really.
Thank you.
So thank you so much for being a part of this.
Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to the film.